Mary was sitting at the kitchen table, mechanically stirring her long cold coffee. The clock on the wall showed 12:30 in the morning. George was working late again, for the third time this week. She looked down at her hands, which were trembling with fatigue and excitement. Something had changed. She could feel it with her whole being. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a car in the yard. Mary straightened up, listening to the familiar footsteps on the porch. The lock clicked, and George entered the house. "Are you still awake?" he asked in surprise, stopping in the kitchen doorway. "I've been waiting for you," Mary answered quietly, looking closely at her husband's face. "You said you'd be back by 8. George sighed in frustration, loosening his tie. "Are you going to start again? I had an important meeting with clients. You know what a difficult time it is at work." "I know." Mary got up from the table. "But you could have at least warned me. I called you 3 times. "The phone was dead," he answered quickly, avoiding her gaze. "Listen, I'm terribly tired. Let's not start this conversation." At that moment, his phone rang loudly. George abruptly yanked it out of his pocket, looked at the screen, and quickly dismissed the call. "Who's calling so late?" Mary asked calmly, feeling her heart start to beat faster. "It's just spam," George said. "You know how annoying they are." Mary slowly walked to the sink and began to wash her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking more and more. "It's weird," she said, trying to control her voice. "Usually spammers don't call at midnight, and it turns out your phone isn't dead." George suddenly flared up. "What are you trying to say? Are you spying on me? Checking up on me?" "No, I'm just—" "You know what?" he interrupted her, raising his voice. "If anyone here needs to explain something, it's you. Why are you walking around so well lately? Who are those new dresses for?" Mary froze, not believing her ears. "What are you talking about? I've always tried to look good." "Yeah, especially when you go to that fitness club of yours." George smiled slyly. "You think I don't notice how you've changed?" Mary felt a lump in her throat. She had been going to the fitness club for 5 years. It was her only consolation after her children left for school, and George was well aware of this. "Are you serious now?" she asked quietly. "After 28 years of marriage, you're accusing me of infidelity?" He came closer, smelling slightly of someone else's perfume. "Maybe you can tell me why you've been texting so much with that trainer of yours?" "Mike?" Mary shook her head. "He's gay, George, and he's married. You were at his wedding last year. You're always making excuses," he said through gritted teeth. "You know what? I'm going to bed. I don't want to continue this pointless conversation." George turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Mary alone. She slowly sank down into a chair, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. Something told her that this was only the beginning. She remembered how last week she had found a receipt from a restaurant for 2 people in his jacket, how he always hid his phone when she came into the room, how his perfume had changed. When she went up to the bedroom an hour later, she found George already asleep. His phone was on the bedside table, the screen facing down. Mary looked at the man she had lived with for almost 3 decades for a long time, and for the first time in all that time, she felt like a complete stranger in her own home. She lay down with her back to her husband and stared into the darkness for a long time. She could not fall asleep. She kept thinking the same thought. Was everything between us a lie? What else is he hiding from me? The next morning, Mary woke up with a heavy head. George had already left for work, leaving behind scattered clothes and unfinished coffee in the kitchen. She was mechanically clearing the table when her eyes rested on an old photograph hanging on the wall of their wedding, 28 years ago. She looks so happy in her white dress. George looks at her with adoration. When did everything start to fall apart? A phone call interrupted her thoughts. It was Linda, their old friend. "Mary, dear, how are you?" Linda's voice sounded too sweet. "I haven't seen you for a long time. I'm fine," Mary lied, feeling strangely tense. "I've been working a lot lately." "Oh, yeah. George told me you've both been very busy." Linda sounded patronizing. "Listen, why don't you meet me for coffee? We can talk." Mary hesitated. Something in her friend's voice alarmed her. "I'm sorry, Linda. I can't make it today. Maybe some other time?" Of course," she replied hastily. "It's just, I'm worried about you, and for your marriage." Mary felt her back go cold. What do you mean? Well, Linda paused dramatically. George has been tense lately. He says things aren't going well at home. That you've changed. He's discussing our marriage with you? Mary could barely contain her anger. Don't be angry, dear. It's just that everyone's noticed how much you've been into your fitness routine, your new clothes. George says you're always texting someone. Mary squeezed the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. Thank you for your concern, Linda, but I think it's best for George and I to sort out our relationship ourselves. As she hung up the phone, Mary felt her hands tremble. George wasn't just accusing her, he was telling his friends about his suspicions. He was trying to make her look guilty in front of everyone. In the evening, when George came home, she tried to talk to him. Why are you telling Linda about our problems? George froze for a moment, then slowly turned to her. Why, does the truth hurt your eyes? Are you afraid that everyone will find out? Find out about what, George? Mary could feel herself starting to boil. About what you've come up with? Thought of, he laughed bitterly. Who came home from fitness last week at 9 in the evening? The class ends at 7, I checked. I was at the supermarket after my workout, Mary exclaimed. I was buying groceries for your favorite dinner. Yeah, and that's why you smelled like a man's cologne? George sneered. Mary froze. What? What cologne? Do you even hear yourself? Everything is clear with you. He waved his hand. You know what? I'm not staying home tonight. I have an important meeting in another city. What meeting? Why didn't you tell me about it before? Do I have to report to you? He turned sharply to her. Maybe you could tell me where you've been disappearing to first? Without waiting for an answer, George went upstairs. A few minutes later, he came downstairs with a small suitcase. Don't wait for me. I'll be back the day after tomorrow. The door closed behind him, leaving Mary alone in the empty house. She slowly sank down on the couch, feeling tears streaming down her cheeks. Linda's words, George's accusations, and the terrible suspicion that it was all a well-established scheme ran through her mind. He was deliberately creating a reputation for her as an unfaithful wife. As Mary went upstairs to her bedroom, she noticed that George had forgotten his diary, the small black notebook he always carried with him. She looked at it for a long time, struggling with herself. She had never allowed herself to read her husband's personal belongings before. But now? Her hand reached for the notebook, but at the last moment she pulled it away. No, she would not stoop to his level. If George was cheating on her, she'd find the evidence another way. The honest way. That night, Mary couldn't sleep for a long time. She was thinking about how quickly trust can break down, how easily a person with whom you have lived most of your life can become a stranger. And the worst part was how skillfully George tried to shift the blame onto her. After a sleepless night, Mary made a decision. No more guesswork and assumptions. It was time to find out the truth. She started with his shirts, which George had left in the laundry. As she went through the clothes, she sniffed at each item. On the white shirt he'd worn 3 days earlier, she could smell the light scent of a woman's perfume, not hers. Her hands trembled as she carefully folded the shirt back up. My God, what have I done? She whispered to herself. I'm going through things like a thief. Suddenly the phone rang. It was Olivia, a mutual friend. Mary, dear, are you okay? George told us about your behavior lately. Mary felt her insides go cold. What behavior, Olivia? Well, she hesitated. He says you've been disappearing all the time, hiding your phone, coming home late. And you believe him? Mary asked quietly. I don't know, honey. He seems so unhappy. He says you've changed, that you don't pay attention to him anymore. Mary broke off the conversation, feeling anger building in her chest. George was methodically turning all his friends against her. Now it became clear why her friends had been looking at her strangely lately, avoiding her. Mary went up to his office and turned on the computer. She had never done this before. She trusted her husband. But now, she had to know the truth. The screen lit up, asking for her password. Mary froze for a moment, then slowly typed in their wedding date. George always used it for important things. The computer unlocked. Oh God, is this all happening to me? She whispered as she opened his email. At first, nothing suspicious. Work emails, bills, advertisements. But then, in the spam folder, she found a correspondence with a woman. Her heart beat faster as she began to read, "Honey, yesterday was great. I can't wait to see you again. I missed you. Those 2 hours in the afternoon are the best hours of my day. Can we meet again at that restaurant? It's so cozy." Mary felt the room begin to spin before her eyes. The correspondence went on for several months. She continued her search and found restaurant bills, always for two, always on days when he said he was working late. In a desk drawer, she found receipts from a jewelry store, earrings, a bracelet, gifts that were never meant for her. Suddenly, the key rattled in the front door. Mary quickly turned off the computer, put everything back in its place, and left the office. George was standing on the doorstep. "What were you doing in my office?" he asked immediately, looking at her suspiciously. "I was cleaning," Mary answered calmly. "Isn't that allowed? Why now?" He came closer, looking at her face. "When else? You work there all the time. I can never clean it properly." George went into the office, looked at the desk, the computer. "Were you looking for something?" His voice sounded threatening. "What would I be looking for, George?" Mary tried to speak calmly, although her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. "I don't know. Maybe letters from your lover?" He smiled slyly. "Did you think I didn't notice you hanging around my office lately?" Mary took a deep breath. "You know what? I'm not going to listen to this. If you're paranoid, get treatment." She turned and left, feeling his heavy gaze on her back. Only in the bedroom did she allow herself to cry. Now she had proof, emails, checks, bills. But what to do with them? How to make him confess? And most importantly, why is he trying so hard to make her look guilty? Lying in bed that night, Mary stared at the ceiling for a long time. She recalled every moment of their life together, trying to understand where she had missed the first signs of infidelity. When did her husband turn into a stranger who was methodically destroying her reputation, preparing the ground for something terrible? The next week, Mary began to act more decisively. She installed a geolocation tracking app on her phone, a feature they had on their phones for business security. George seemed to have forgotten about it. Sitting in the office of their real estate company, she stared at a small speck on the screen. George said he was on his way to meet a client in the northern part of the city. The speck showed a fashionable neighborhood in the south, where expensive restaurants were located. "Mary, can I see you?" Helen, their accountant, who had been working with them for 15 years, looked in the door. "Come in." Mary quickly turned off her phone screen. Helen looked worried. I need to talk to you. It's about the company's finances." Mary felt her back go cold. "Is something wrong? You see..." Helen was nervously looking through the papers. "I noticed some strange transactions. Large sums of money are being transferred to an account I've never seen before. What account?" Mary felt her throat go dry. "It's in the company's name, but..." Helen handed her a printout. "Look, over the last 3 months, almost $50,000 has gone into it." Mary stared at the numbers, feeling the ground slipping away from under her feet. Who signed these transfers? "George," Helen answered quietly. "I tried to ask him, but he said it was confidential, and I had no right to pry." At that moment, Mary's phone vibrated. A message from the bank. An attempt to withdraw a large sum from their joint account. "Excuse me, Helen. I have to go check on something right away." Mary grabbed her bag and flew out of the office. At the bank, she was greeted with respect. After all, she was a longtime customer. The manager studied the documents for a long time. "Mrs. Anderson, your husband did try to withdraw $100,000. But since it's a joint account and the amount exceeds the limit, we need your signature as well. Thank you for letting us know." Mary tried to sound calm. "I do not consent to this transaction." Back in the car, she looked at her phone. The dot that marked George was still at the same restaurant. Mary started the engine and drove there. When she parked nearby, she saw her husband's car. Her heart was pounding as she approached the entrance to the restaurant. Through the huge windows, she could see the hall clearly. And then she saw them. George was sitting at a table in the corner, holding Linda's hand. Linda, their old friend, the woman who had recently been so concerned about their marriage. They were talking animatedly about something, laughing. Then, Linda leaned across the table and George kissed her. Mary felt nauseous. She staggered and grabbed the wall. An elderly couple passing by looked at her with concern. "Are you all right, dear?" "Yes, yes," Mary whispered. "Just a little dizzy." She got to the car and sat for a long time, clutching the steering wheel. A picture stood before her eyes. George and Linda, so happy, so in love. And she, the fool, had been doubting herself all this time, making excuses to others. The phone rang. "George." "Yes?" Her voice sounded strangely calm. "Where are you? Why did you leave the office? And where are you, George?" she asked, just as calmly. Pause. "At a client meeting, you know. Really?" Mary looked at the entrance of the restaurant. "And how is this client doing? What do you mean?" His voice became tense. "Nothing, dear. I was just wondering. By the way," the bank called, "something about a large amount of money you wanted to withdraw. It's for business," he coughed. "I'll explain later." Of course, Mary saw George and Linda leave the restaurant. "I'll explain later. You have an important meeting right now." She hung up the phone and started the car. On the way home, tears streamed down her face, but she no longer felt confused or guilty. Now she knew the truth, and she knew what to do next. The following days turned into a real test for Mary. George, unaware that she had seen everything, became even more aggressive in his accusations. One evening, while she was preparing dinner, he burst into the kitchen waving some papers. "Can you explain this?" He threw a printout of phone calls on the table. Mary calmly wiped her hands on a towel. "What exactly are you interested in? Don't pretend." He pointed at the list. "Why do you call this number several times a day?" Mary looked at the paper. It was the number of their son Michael, who was studying in another city. "This is our son's number, George. I call him every day, just like I have for the last 3 years since he left to study." George was confused for a moment, but quickly recovered. "And this number?" He pointed to another line. "You're going to say it's a family member too?" "This is my doctor's number," Mary answered quietly. "I'm having a checkup." "A checkup?" He smiled slyly. "And why don't I know anything about it? Because you haven't shown any interest in what's going on with me for the last few months." At that moment, his phone rang. George looked at the screen and quickly dismissed the call. "Don't change the subject. You—" The phone rang again. Mary noticed the name on the screen. L. "Do you want to answer it?" she asked calmly. "It seems to be something urgent. None of your business." He flew out of the kitchen, pressing the phone to his ear. Mary slowly sank into a chair. George's muffled voice came from the living room. "Not now. I can't talk. I'll see you tomorrow." The next day, Mary was in for another blow. When she arrived at the office, her co-workers looked at her strangely and whispered. Finally, Clarice, their secretary, approached her. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm so sorry, but Mr. Anderson told me that you no longer work for the company." Mary felt her legs give out. What did he say? He told everyone that you're getting a divorce and that from now on, all matters must be taken up with him. George's office was empty. On the desk was an envelope with her name on it. Inside was a letter of resignation, allegedly signed by her. "He forged the signature," Mary whispered, looking at the document. He wasn't even ashamed. Helen, the accountant, was standing in the doorway. "I need to talk to you, in private." They went into a small conference room. Helen was nervously looking through the papers. "I found something else. He's transferring money for a reason. He's getting ready to sell the company." "What?" Mary felt her insides go cold. "But this is our company together." "I know." Helen handed her the documents. "He forged your signature on several important papers, and he changed the company's bylaws. Now you don't have a say in the decisions." Mary flipped through the documents with trembling hands. Her signature was there, but not hers. The dates, the seals, everything looked official. George had been preparing for this for a long time, methodically and carefully. "When did this start?" she asked quietly. "About 6 months ago." Helen looked away. At first there were small amounts, then larger ones, and 2 months ago, a new co-owner came in, Linda Peterson. Mary smiled bitterly. So this is it. Not just an affair. She and Linda were planning to take over the company she and George had been building for 20 years. Why are you telling me this? Mary asked. You're risking your job. Because it's wrong, Helen replied firmly. I've been working here for 15 years. I've seen you and George start from scratch, work day and night. And what he's doing? It's just despicable. When Mary returned home, she found George packing his suitcase. What are you doing? I'm going on a business trip, he said without looking at her. A business trip or to Linda's? George froze. What are you talking about? Stop it, Mary said tiredly. I know everything. About your affair with Linda, about the fraud with the company, about the forged documents. He turned to her slowly. A strange glint appeared in his eyes. Prove it. What? Prove your accusations, he said, coming closer. Do you have any evidence? Witnesses? Something other than your hysterical fantasies? Mary took a step back. You know I'm right. No? He laughed. All I know is that my wife has been acting strangely lately, accusing me of all her sins, and seems to need professional help. What do you mean? I mean that hysterical women who invent infidelities and conspiracies are usually treated by a psychiatrist. Mary felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. This was his next move. To make her look crazy, to take away not only her company, but her reputation. You wouldn't dare, she whispered. Dare what? He raised his eyebrows innocently. Help my sick wife get the treatment she needs? It's my duty, my dear. He took his suitcase and went to the door. Think about it while I'm gone, and maybe we should make an appointment with a good specialist. The door closed behind him. Mary slowly sank into her chair, feeling her whole body tremble. She realized now that this was war, and George would stop at nothing to destroy her. Mary was sitting in a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, away from her familiar surroundings. Her hands were shaking as she picked up her coffee cup. Sitting across from her was Marta, her oldest friend from college, who had come from out of town after Mary's disturbing phone call. You've lost weight, Martha said gently, looking at her friend carefully. And your eyes? When was the last time you slept well? Mary smiled bitterly. I don't remember. Maybe a week ago? A month? Tell me everything. Martha covered her hand with her own. From the beginning. And Mary began to tell. About her first suspicions, about George's strange behavior, about his accusations, about Linda, about the company. The words poured out as if a dam had burst. Martha listened silently, squeezing her hand from time to time. You know, Martha said quietly when Mary finished her story, this reminds me of my story. Do you remember Robert? Mary nodded. Robert was Martha's first husband, and they divorced 15 years ago. He did the same thing, Martha continued. First accusations, then manipulation, trying to make me look crazy. It's called gaslighting, when a person makes you doubt your own perception of reality. But why? Mary wiped away the tears that had spontaneously flowed down her cheeks. Why all these complicated games? Why not just leave if you don't love him anymore? Because it's not about love. Martha shook her head. It's about control and money. Think about it. If he just left, you would have half the property and the company. And now? He's trying to make me feel guilty, Mary finished, so that he can take everything in the divorce. They were silent. Outside the coffee shop, rain was falling, and people were hurrying about under umbrellas, preoccupied with their own business. A typical autumn day when someone's life is falling apart. What should I do, Martha? Mary asked quietly. I feel like I'm trapped. If I tell him I know he's cheating, he'll accuse me of being paranoid. If I keep quiet, he'll continue his machinations. Marta stirred her coffee thoughtfully. You need a good lawyer. Someone from outside the city, someone independent, someone George can't bribe or intimidate. Do you think it's that serious? Mary, darling. Martha looked her straight in the eye. He's already forged your signature on the company's documents. That's a felony, and he won't stop until he gets his way. At that moment, Mary's phone vibrated. A message from her son. "Mom, Dad called. He says he's worried about your mental health. Is it true? What's going on?" Mary showed the message to Martha. She shook her head. "See? He's already starting to turn the kids against you. Classic tactic." "My God," Mary whispered. "How did it come to this? 28 years of marriage? Listen to me carefully." Martha took her hands. "It's not your fault. Do you hear me? Everything that is happening is his choice, his meanness. Don't let him make you doubt yourself." Suddenly, Mary noticed a familiar car outside her window. Linda's car had driven past the coffee shop. "They're watching me," she whispered. "Even here." "All the more reason," Martha said firmly. "We need a plan. I'll stay in town for a few days. I'll help you find a lawyer and gather all the necessary documents. But your job—" "To hell with work," Martha interrupted. "You're more important, and I'm not going to let that bastard break you like Robert tried to break me." They sat in the coffee shop for a few more hours, drawing up a plan of action. For the first time in days, Mary felt a glimmer of hope. She was no longer alone. She has support. She has someone who understands what she is going through. When they went outside, the rain had stopped. Marta hugged her friend tightly. "Remember, you are stronger than you think, and we will get through this together." On the way home, Mary thought about their conversation. Yes, she is no longer the naive woman she was a month ago. She knows the truth and knows what to do next. And most importantly, she is no longer alone. The morning began with a knock at the door. Mary, who had hardly slept that night, was already sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, was standing on the doorstep. "Good morning, dear," she said, nervously fiddling with the edges of her scarf. "May I come in for a minute?" Mary let her neighbor into the kitchen. "Of course, come in. Would you like some coffee?" No, I won't be long." Mrs. Thompson sat down on the edge of the chair. "You see, I hesitated for a long time about telling you this, but my conscience—" She fell silent, searching for words. Mary waited patiently. "I've been seeing them for months," the neighbor finally said. "You're George and this, Linda. They meet at her country house, the one on Maple Street." Mary slowly set down her cup. "Are you sure?" "Honey, I've lived here for 30 years. I remember when you and George first moved here, so young and in love. And believe me, I wouldn't be saying this if I wasn't sure." Mrs. Thompson sighed. "Yesterday I heard them talking. They were standing by the car, thinking that no one was there. They were planning to go away together. Somewhere in Europe, I think. And they were talking about money. A lot of money." Mary felt her insides go cold. Europe? So that's where the company's money had gone. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I know it's not right to interfere." Mrs. Thompson stood up. "But you're a good woman, Mary. You don't deserve this." After she left, Mary sat still for a long time. Then she dialed Martha's number. "Can you come over? I need to check something out." An hour later, they were on their way to the house on Maple Street. It was a beautiful mansion surrounded by a high fence. "Are you sure?" Martha asked as she parked the car around the corner. "I need to know," Mary replied. They waited for almost 3 hours. Finally, George's car pulled up to the house. He got out, looked around, and quickly walked through the gate. "Is that enough?" Martha asked gently. "You already know the truth." "Wait," Mary whispered. Half an hour later, another car arrived. Linda got out, elegant as ever, with a large folder of documents in her hands. "Jesus," Mary breathed. "They're not even hiding. Let's get out of here." Martha started the engine. "No," Mary suddenly said firmly. "I want to look them in the eye." "What?" "Mary, don't be silly." But Mary had already gotten out of the car. With a firm step, she walked to the gate and pressed the bell. Linda answered the door. When she saw Mary, she froze. "Oh. Mary? What are you—" "May I come in?" Mary asked calmly. "Is my husband busy?" George's voice came from the back of the house. "Who is it, dear?" "Your wife," Mary answered loudly. "Or rather, My wife for now." There was a dead silence. Then there were footsteps, and George appeared in the hallway. His face was as white as chalk. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see how you're planning your escape to Europe." Mary walked past the stunned Linda. "Oh, and they took your documents. Must be something important?" Linda clutched the folder to her chest. "It's not what you think." "Really?" Mary looked her straight in the eye. "What am I supposed to think when my supposed friend meets my husband in a secret house? When you steal money from the company together? When you plan to run away, leaving me with nothing?" "That's enough," George snapped. "You're hysterical. You're making up." "I know everything," Mary interrupted him. "About the forged documents, about the secret accounts, about your plans. And you know what? I'm not afraid of you anymore." She turned to the exit. "Oh, yes. One more thing. I hired a lawyer. A very good lawyer. He will be delighted with all your machinations." She turned at the doorway. George and Linda stood there frozen. "One more thing. Linda, I hope you realize he's going to do the same thing to you. Sooner or later?" Marta was waiting in the car, ready to call the police at any moment. When she saw Mary, she breathed a sigh of relief. "You're crazy. How could you—" "You know," Mary interrupted her, fastening her seatbelt, "for the first time in a long time, I feel alive and strong." They drove away, leaving behind the house where the last illusions had been shattered. But Mary no longer felt pain, only determination and a strange relief. Now everything was back to normal. "Where to now?" asked Martha. "To the lawyer," Mary answered firmly. "It's time to start the fight." The lawyer's office was spacious and bright. Miss Carter, a woman in her 50s with penetrating brown eyes, carefully studied the documents Mary had brought in. "This is serious," she finally said, taking off her glasses. "Forgery, illegal financial transactions, attempted alienation of joint property. Your husband is taking a big risk." "He thinks I won't dare," Mary answered quietly. "That I'll be afraid of a scandal. And you?" Miss Carter looked at her intently. "Are you afraid?" "Not anymore." Mary squared her shoulders. "I want justice." At that moment, her phone rang. "George, may I?" she asked the lawyer. She nodded. "Where are you?" George's voice sounded tense. "We need to talk. Do we?" Mary replied calmly. "I think we've already discussed everything. At Linda's house. Listen." He paused. "What you saw, it's not what you think. We were just discussing company business." Mary smiled bitterly. "Company business? You mean the documents where you forged my signature? Or the accounts in European banks?" A long pause. "How did you—" "I'm not as stupid as you think," Mary interrupted him. "And not as weak." "Good." His voice became hard. "You want a war? You can have it. But think about the children. Think about our reputation. You should have thought about your reputation when you cheated on me with our friend, when you stole money from the company, when you were trying to make me look like a crazy person." Miss Carter nodded in approval. She was quickly writing something down. "Mary," George's voice was almost pleading, "let's meet. Let's talk calmly. I'll explain everything." "Okay," Mary suddenly agreed. "Let's meet. In our office, in an hour. And bring Linda. She's your main business partner now." She hung up the phone and looked at the lawyer. "Is this right?" "Absolutely." Miss Carter began to put the documents in her briefcase. "I'm going with you. I think this conversation will be important." They were already waiting in the office. George was sitting at his desk, with Linda nervously shifting from one foot to the other. When they saw the lawyer, they exchanged anxious glances. "Meet her," Mary said calmly. "Miss Carter, my lawyer." "What's this all about?" George asked sharply. "We could have settled this like a family style?" Mary pulled a folder out of her bag. "Like these documents with the forged signatures? Or maybe like these secret account statements?" Linda turned pale. "How did you get—" "I have a lot of things," Mary interrupted. "For example, security footage from the restaurants where you met, hotel receipts, witness statements." George stood up slowly. "What do you want?" "Justice," Mary replied firmly. "First, you'll return all the money you took from the company. Second, you will restore my rights as a co-owner. Thirdly, and if not," he interrupted. Then, Miss Carter interjected, we will hand over all the evidence to the police. Forgery, fraud, misappropriation of funds are serious crimes, Mr. Anderson. Linda suddenly grabbed her bag. I have to go. Are you scared? Mary asked calmly. That's right, because you're an accomplice too, and you're going to be held accountable. George! Linda looked around in panic. Do something. But George remained silent, staring at the documents Miss Carter had laid out on the table. I give you 24 hours, the lawyer said. Either we sign a settlement on our terms, or the case goes to trial. And believe me, the judges will love this story. When they left the office, Mary felt her legs shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her tired. You did great, Miss Carter said. You handled it well. Do you think they'll go for it? They will, the lawyer replied confidently. Because they know we have them pinned down. They have no choice. On the way home, Mary thought about how strange everything had turned out. A month ago, she was a scared, confused woman who doubted her own sanity. And now... The phone rang again. This time, it was Linda. Mary? Her voice trembled. I wanted to say, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't help. Mary replied calmly and hung up the phone. At home, she stood in front of the mirror for a long time, looking at her reflection. Yes, new wrinkles had appeared in the corners of her eyes, and gray strands of hair had appeared in her hair. But a new fire was burning in her eyes, a fire of strength and determination. I can do this, she told her reflection. I'm starting over. The following weeks flew by in a blur. George and Linda, with their backs against the wall, agreed to Mary's terms. The money was returned to the company's accounts, the documents were restored, and Mary regained her legal rights as co-owner. One morning, while sorting through the mail, she found a large envelope. Inside were divorce papers with George's signature. She stared at his handwriting for a long time, so familiar, so dear to her. Surprisingly, her heart was no longer in pain. Is everything okay? Asked Martha, who had stayed in town to support her friend. Yes. Mary put the documents on the table. It's just 28 years. That's a lifetime. Not a lifetime, Martha corrected gently. Part of it, and not the best part of it. At that moment, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Thompson stood on the doorstep. Mary, dear, may I come in? They went into the kitchen. The neighbor nervously crumpled her handkerchief in her hands. I heard, everyone already knows about the divorce, and about Linda. Yes, Mary calmly confirmed. It's true. You know, Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, some of the neighbors, they want to apologize for believing the gossip about you, for turning their backs on you. Mary smiled. It's okay. People often believe what is convenient for them to believe. You're so strong. Her neighbor sighed. I couldn't have done it. Yes, you could, Mary interrupted her. When you have no choice, you find strength. After Mrs. Thompson left, Mary went upstairs. George's clothes were still in the bedroom suits, ties, watches. She began to put them in boxes. What are you going to do with this? Martha asked, helping her. I'm going to give it to him. He can have it all. I don't need things that remind me of a lie. In one of the drawers she found an old album, their wedding, their first house, the birth of their children. Tears came to her eyes. Hey! Marta put her arms around her shoulders. It's the past. It was, but it's over. You know what's the strangest thing? Mary wiped away her tears. I don't hate him anymore. Only regret. I'm sorry that he turned out to be so petty, so mean. In the evening, the children arrived, Michael and Emma, and they already knew the truth. Mom, Emma hugged her tightly. Why didn't you tell us right away? I didn't want to give you a choice. Mary patted her daughter's head. You don't have to choose between your parents, but he... Michael clenched his fists. How could he do this to you? Hush, hush. Mary took her son's hand. This is our problem with him. He's still your father. Later, when the children went to bed, Mary sat on the terrace. The starry sky stretched out overhead, just as it had 28 years ago when she and George first bought the house. What are you thinking about? Martha brought her a cup of tea. About the future, Mary smiled. You know, I've signed up for an interior design course. I've always wanted to do that. Really? Martha was excited. That's great. Yes. Mary sipped her tea. And another thing, I've decided to sell my share of the company. I don't want to work with George anymore. What's there to live on? I'm going to start my own business. Small, but my own. No lies, no fraud. They were silent, looking at the stars. You know, Martha finally said, when I divorced Robert, I thought my life was over, but it turned out that it was just beginning. Mary squeezed her friend's hand. Thank you, for everything. For what? For not letting me break. For believing in me when others turned their backs. The next morning, George came to pick up his things. He looked old, gaunt. Mary, he began. Don't, she interrupted. Just take your things and go. I was going to say, what? That you're sorry? That you made a mistake? She shook her head. You know what's funny? I'm actually grateful to you. Grateful? He looked at her in surprise. Yes, I am. Because if it weren't for your meanness, I would never have realized how strong I am. I would never have dared to change my life. George silently took the boxes and left. Mary watched him go, and for the first time in a long time, she felt not pain but relief. He no longer had power over her. She was free. A year passed. Mary stood at the window of her new office, a small but cozy space in the city center. Her first interior design projects hung on the walls, and catalogs and fabric samples lay on the table. Designed by Mary was a simple inscription on the door, but for her it meant much more than just the name of the company. Mrs. Anders. Excuse me, Miss Clark. Kate's young assistant came in. You have a customer waiting for you. Mary smiled. She had returned to her maiden name immediately after the divorce. It was the first step to a new life. An elegant woman in her 60s stood on the doorstep. I heard about you from Mrs. Thompson. She said you work wonders with interiors. Please, sit down. Mary gestured to a chair. Tell us, what would you like to change in your home? While the client was talking about her wishes, Mary took notes. Her hands were no longer shaking, her voice was confident, and her eyes were filled with a calm wisdom. After the meeting, she had a lunch break. In a small cafe around the corner, Marta was waiting for her, who had come for their monthly meeting. You look great, she hugged her friend. I feel good too. Mary sat down at a table. You know, I met Linda yesterday at the supermarket. How did it go? Nothing, Mary shrugged. She looked away and quickly walked away. And I didn't even feel anything, as if I had met a random stranger. And George? I heard they didn't work out? Yeah, Mary sipped her coffee. The kids told me that she left him when she realized there was no more money. Now he lives alone, works in a small real estate firm. Do you have any regrets? No, Mary answered firmly. You know what I've realized this year? Happiness is not about a relationship with a man. It's about the relationship with yourself. In the afternoon, Mary went to the site, a large house where she was doing her biggest project. The workers were just finishing up the finishing touches. It looks great, said the owner of the house, an elderly lady named Green. You know, I was hesitant at first, but when I saw your eyes, there was such an inner strength in them. In the evening, Mary conducted an online counseling session for women going through divorce. It was her volunteer work, giving back to others what she had once received. How do you get over a betrayal? Asked one of the participants. How do you start trusting people again? Start by trusting yourself, Mary answered. When you trust yourself, the betrayal of others cannot break you. Later, the children arrived, and now they often visited their mother. Michael had recently gotten engaged, and Emma had been promoted at work. You know, Mom, Emma said as she helped set the table, you've been an example to me. When I have problems at work, I think, what would Mom do? Oh, honey, Mary hugged her daughter, just remember that no circumstances can break you without your consent. After dinner, when the children left, Mary went out to the garden. She had planted new flowers there with her own hands last spring, a symbol of a new beginning. Now they were in full bloom. On the table was a letter, an invitation to speak at a conference for women entrepreneurs. Success story, how to start a new life after 50, was the topic of her speech. Mary sat down in her favorite chair, looking at the sunset. Her phone was ringing softly, messages from friends, clients, children. She was no longer alone. She was no longer a victim. In the bedroom, on the dressing table, there was a small plaque she had bought right after the divorce. The words were engraved on it. Sometimes, the worst moments of our lives lead us to where we need to be. As she fell asleep, Mary thought about everything that had happened over the past year, about the pain that had hardened her, about the betrayal that made her stronger, about the losses that opened the way to new opportunities. She was no longer George Anderson's wife. She was Mary Clark, a designer, an entrepreneur, a mother, a friend, a mentor to other women. And she was exactly the woman she had always wanted to be. Before falling asleep, she whispered the words that became her daily mantra. Thank you, betrayal, for showing me my true strength. Thank you, pain, for teaching me to value myself. And thank you, new life, for giving me a chance to start over. A warm spring wind blew through the open window, bringing the scent of flowers from the garden. Mary smiled. Tomorrow will be a new day, and it would be beautiful.